A millionaire CEO left his wife for another woman. Years later, he wept when he saw her with the daughter he never knew. Alexander Blake had always believed he was the kind of man who could separate his heart from his ambition. From the day he founded his first company, he built his life on discipline, calculated decisions, and the conviction that nothing should matter more than success. He wore the same style of tailored suit every day, dark fabric that set off his cold blue eyes, and he surrounded himself with people who admired his precision and feared his judgment. When he married Skylar, some of his colleagues were surprised. She was everything he was not: warm, hopeful, too willing to see the good in people. She was beautiful, her blonde hair shining in any light, and for a brief time he almost convinced himself that her softness wouldn't be an obstacle. But over the years, the gap between them widened until it became a chasm neither of them knew how to cross. Skylar tried, again and again, to remind him that they were supposed to be building a life together rather than existing as two strangers sharing the same address. She left small notes in his briefcase, messages that said she loved him or missed him, but he rarely even unfolded them. When she asked him to have dinner at home instead of taking every meal at work or in restaurants, he promised he would, but somehow he never did. She told herself it was just the pressure of his career, that it would get better once the next merger was finalized. But in her heart she knew he was choosing to keep her at arm's length because it was easier for him not to care too much. It was an evening like any other when everything finally broke. She had waited up for him in the living room, her hands clasped in her lap, the soft yellow light catching in her hair. She had been crying long before he came home, but she had wiped her face and tried to steady her breathing. She didn't want to sound hysterical. She just wanted him to hear her. He set down his phone with the practiced impatience of a man who thought every conversation was a distraction from something more important. Before he could speak, she said his name, and something in her voice made him pause. "I can't keep pretending this doesn't hurt me," she whispered. He didn't respond. She looked up at him, searching for even a flicker of the man she had married, but all she saw was exhaustion and indifference. She told him she felt like she was disappearing, that she couldn't remember the last time he'd asked her what she needed. Her voice broke when she said she loved him but didn't know how to live like this anymore. He was silent for so long she thought maybe he would turn and walk away without a word. Instead, he let out a slow breath, his expression flat, and said, "I can't do this anymore either. I need a different life." Her throat closed, and she pressed a hand to her chest as if she could keep her heart from falling apart. "A different life?" she echoed. He nodded, as though they were discussing a quarterly budget instead of the end of everything that had ever mattered to her. "I'm sorry," he said, though he didn't sound sorry. "I just can't keep pretending this marriage works." The rest was a blur. He left the house without looking back, and she sat there on the edge of the couch, too stunned to cry. She didn't know then that the moment he closed the door was the moment he closed the chapter of his life that could never be reopened. She didn't know she was already carrying a part of him he would spend years wishing he had stayed to meet. Skylar didn't leave right away because for several days she couldn't make herself believe it was really over. She woke each morning expecting to hear his familiar footsteps outside the bedroom door or the muted sound of his voice on a business call. When the hours passed in silence, the truth began to sink into her bones like something cold and heavy. She moved through the rooms of their house like a guest who had overstayed her welcome, touching the back of the chair where he always draped his jacket, running her fingers over the smooth kitchen counter where he used to set his briefcase, feeling smaller each time she realized he was never coming back. The bed felt too big. The quiet was unbearable. She tried to fill it with music and phone calls to the few friends she still trusted, but nothing could disguise the fact that she was alone. She thought she would feel angry, but mostly she felt hollow. It was as if all the years of trying to hold them together had drained her of the strength to hate him properly. She wanted to scream at him, to demand an explanation for why he had chosen someone else, but the last conversation they'd shared replayed in her mind over and over. The flat tone of his voice when he told her he needed a different life was worse than any shouting match. He had sounded so sure, so resolved, that there was no hope left to argue for. She began to understand that nothing she could have said would have made him stay. When she realized she was late, that her body was telling her something she hadn't dared imagine, she sat on the bathroom floor with her hand pressed flat over her belly, her heart hammering so hard she thought she might faint. For a long time she stayed there, staring at the test in her hand, and let the tears fall in silence. It was almost cruel how quickly the knowledge shifted everything. She wasn't just a woman left behind. She was a mother now, whether he ever came back or not. The thought terrified her. It also gave her the smallest flicker of purpose in the darkness. She knew she couldn't stay in that house, surrounded by ghosts of a life she had already lost. She began packing slowly, methodically, folding her clothes with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. She took only what she needed, leaving behind the things that had been part of their shared story, the framed photos on the mantel, the wedding china, the pressed flower he'd given her once in the early days when he still knew how to be tender. By the time she zipped her suitcase, she felt like she had shed a skin she could never wear again. She moved to a small town 2 hours away where no one knew her last name. The landlord didn't ask why she needed the place immediately or why her voice shook when she handed over the deposit. The apartment was small, just a living room and 1 bedroom, but it was clean and quiet, and it was hers. She lay awake on the first night listening to the unfamiliar creaks of the old pipes and realized she was more afraid than she had ever been. But she also felt something close to relief because at least here she would not have to pretend. When her belly began to swell beneath her clothes, she wrapped her arms around it every morning before getting out of bed, reminding herself that she was not truly alone. At her first doctor's appointment, she sat in the waiting room with her hands folded tight in her lap, wondering if she would ever feel strong enough to do this by herself. But when she heard the heartbeat, fast and steady, she closed her eyes and let a single sob escape her throat. It was the first sound she had made in weeks that wasn't just grief. She found work at a small bookstore that didn't care that she was pregnant. The owner, a woman named Nancy with a kind smile and tired eyes, let her sit behind the counter when her feet began to ache. Skylar learned to sort the shipments and stack the displays, grateful for something to occupy her mind. At night, she lay with her hand resting over the curve of her stomach, whispering promises to the baby she carried. She promised that she would never leave. She promised that she would try, every day, to be enough for both of them. She knew she couldn't change what Alexander had done. She couldn't undo the choice he made to walk away. But she could choose something different for herself and for her child. And in the quiet of that tiny apartment, she decided that surviving would be the first thing she taught her daughter. The months that followed were measured in small, private milestones no one else saw. Skylar counted them carefully, the first time she felt the baby turn inside her like a promise she wasn't sure she deserved, the day she found the second-hand crib someone had left by the dumpster and spent hours scrubbing it clean, the moment she caught her reflection in the bathroom mirror and almost didn't recognize the woman staring back. Her cheeks had hollowed, her hair hung in a limp braid over her shoulder, and her eyes were tired in a way that went deeper than lost sleep. But there was something steadier in her expression too, a quiet determination she hadn't known she possessed until there was no other choice. She stopped following the news about Alexander, though sometimes his name still found her by accident. Once, when she was standing in line at the grocery store, she glanced at a glossy magazine near the register and saw his face staring back. He looked the same as always, impeccable in his dark suit, a practiced smile on his lips. The headline called him a visionary. She turned the magazine face down and set her groceries on the belt, her hands trembling so hard she nearly dropped the bread. The cashier asked if she was all right, and Skylar nodded without meeting her eyes. She walked home with her shopping bag clutched to her chest, repeating silently that it didn't matter anymore, that he didn't matter. But that night, after she put away the groceries and sat on the edge of her bed, she allowed herself the truth she never spoke aloud. A part of her still missed the idea of him, the man she had loved before he decided he needed a different life. When her daughter finally arrived in the early hours of a cold autumn morning, Skylar felt a fear so huge it nearly crushed her. She was alone in the small delivery room, gripping the rails of the bed while nurses moved briskly around her. She had never imagined bringing a child into the world without a hand to hold. But when the final push came and she heard a sharp, indignant cry, something inside her cracked wide open. The nurse placed the baby on her chest, and Skylar looked down into a tiny, perfect face framed by dark hair that already reminded her of someone she wasn't ready to forgive. The baby blinked up at her with clear blue eyes, and all the loneliness of the past year dissolved in an instant. She named her Olivia. In those first days at home, Skylar felt like she was learning how to breathe again. Every routine, feeding, rocking, changing tiny diapers, was clumsy at first. She cried as often as the baby did. But when Olivia wrapped a tiny hand around her finger, Skylar discovered that there was still room inside her heart for love that was pure and untainted by disappointment. Money was tight in ways that sometimes kept her awake at night. The bookstore job ended when she couldn't stand behind a counter with a newborn strapped to her chest. She found work cleaning offices after hours, carrying Olivia along in her carrier, pausing every few minutes to check if she was still sleeping. Some nights she came home so tired she thought her legs would give out on the stairs. But even when her body ached and her mind was clouded with worry, she never once wished she had chosen differently. Olivia was the only part of her life that felt like it had never been a mistake. When Olivia was old enough to giggle, to clutch at her hair and babble nonsense, Skylar began to feel the first fragile pieces of herself knitting back together. She learned to stop imagining what it would have been like if Alexander had stayed. She stopped picturing him in the delivery room or beside her at the kitchen table. Instead, she focused on each ordinary miracle, the weight of her daughter asleep on her chest, the softness of her hair under Skylar's palm, the way her laughter filled every empty space. She told herself that this was enough, that the life she was building didn't need his shadow in it. But some nights, after Olivia finally surrendered to sleep and the apartment went quiet again, Skylar would stand by the window, looking out at the streetlight shining through the trees. She would press her hand to the glass and admit to the darkness that no matter how much time passed, a small part of her still wanted him to see what he had left behind. She didn't want his pity or his excuses. She only wanted him to know that what he had abandoned had become something beautiful without him. And then she would turn away and close the curtains because she refused to let that longing shape her life any longer. It was almost 4 years to the day since Skylar had last seen Alexander when everything she thought she had buried resurfaced with a single unexpected encounter. She hadn't planned to be anywhere near the city he called his domain. She hadn't even planned to leave town that morning. But Olivia had developed a cough that worried her enough to take the first appointment she could get, which happened to be at the children's clinic across from one of the tall glass towers that still bore Alexander's name in silver letters over the entrance. She told herself it didn't matter. She would be in and out. No one would see her. No ghosts would rise up from behind those mirrored windows to remind her how much she had lost. She had bundled Olivia in her warm pink coat, the one with the big buttons she loved to fiddle with. On the bus ride, the little girl fell asleep leaning against her shoulder, and Skylar closed her eyes, breathing in the soft scent of her hair. For a moment, she felt steady, like everything she had rebuilt couldn't be shaken by a place or a memory. When they arrived, she carried Olivia up the clinic steps, smiling as the receptionist complimented her daughter's bright blue eyes. Those eyes were the only feature she never managed to explain away. Everyone assumed they were from Skylar's side of the family, and she never corrected them. She told herself she owed Olivia the truth someday, but she wasn't ready to give it yet. The appointment went quickly, nothing serious, just a lingering cold. They left the clinic as late afternoon light turned the glass of the office towers into sheets of gold. Skylar should have walked straight to the bus stop. She should have kept her head down and never looked back. But as she adjusted Olivia's scarf, she felt the unmistakable sense of being watched. Slowly, she lifted her gaze across the plaza, and her breath caught so sharply she thought she might choke. Alexander was standing on the steps of his building, flanked by 2 men in suits who were saying something to him, but he wasn't listening. His eyes were fixed on her. She had no idea how long he had been standing there, how much of her he had already taken in. She tried to look away, but she couldn't. The years fell away in an instant, and she was 26 again, standing in their kitchen while he told her he needed a different life. For several heartbeats, they simply stared at each other across the space that had grown between them. His face was older, sharper around the eyes, but the shock on it was unmistakable. She didn't know what he saw when he looked at her, whether he recognized the woman he'd left or if she was a stranger to him now. A dozen thoughts collided in her mind. She should walk away. She should protect herself, protect Olivia. But her legs wouldn't move. Then, slowly, his gaze dropped to the little girl standing at her side, holding her hand. Skylar felt the air leave her lungs as she realized this was the moment she had both dreaded and secretly wished for, the moment he saw the undeniable proof of everything he'd chosen to abandon. His eyes widened, and his lips parted as if he were about to call out, but no sound came. Olivia glanced up at her, confused by the sudden tension, and tightened her grip on her fingers. Skylar swallowed hard. She knew she couldn't let him be the first to speak. She didn't want her daughter's memory of this day to begin with the sound of his voice. So she bent down and brushed a stray hair from Olivia's cheek, her hand trembling just slightly. "Come on, sweetheart," she said as calmly as she could manage. "It's time to go home." But when she straightened, Alexander had already crossed half the distance between them. She saw him move with a determination that was at odds with the shock still etched into his features. One of his colleagues called after him, but he didn't turn back. His eyes were locked on Olivia, then on her, and Skylar felt the ground tilt under her feet. He stopped a few paces away, breathing hard as though he'd run the whole way. "Skylar," he said, and her name on his lips made something sharp and aching twist inside her chest. He looked at her as if he needed her to confirm what he already knew. His voice was unsteady when he spoke again. "Is she?" Skylar lifted her chin, refusing to flinch. She saw a crowd gathering around them at the edges of the plaza, people pretending not to watch. She didn't care. She had carried this truth alone for too long to be ashamed of it now. "Her name is Olivia," she said evenly. "And yes. She's your daughter." The last of the color drained from his face. For a moment, she thought he might fall. His hand came up to cover his mouth, and in his eyes she saw something she never thought she'd see in him, raw, naked regret. The world around them kept moving, cars and voices and late afternoon shadows, but for Skylar, time stopped. She didn't know what he would say next. She didn't know what she would allow herself to hear. All she knew was that nothing could ever be the same again. For a long moment, Alexander just stood there in front of her, his breathing ragged, as if every word he needed had abandoned him. The polished glass facade behind him reflected the image of the man he had spent years becoming, powerful, composed, unreachable. But standing here, with the late sunlight catching in Olivia's hair and Skylar's gaze locked on his, he looked nothing like that figure. He looked like someone whose entire foundation had just cracked open. Skylar tried to keep her expression calm, but inside she felt like she was standing too close to a cliff's edge. Olivia pressed closer to her leg, sensing the weight of the moment even if she didn't understand it. Skylar rested her hand gently on her daughter's shoulder and forced herself to breathe evenly, because she would not let him see her afraid. Alexander's hand dropped from his mouth, and he swallowed with effort. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded hoarse and unfamiliar. "I didn't know," he said. The words seemed pulled out of him like something painful. "Skylar, I swear to you, I didn't know you were pregnant when I left." She didn't answer right away because she had imagined this conversation too many times. In her mind, she had always been prepared to unleash every piece of anger she had stored up all these years. But now that he was here, looking at her not with arrogance but with something like devastation, she found her voice quieter than she expected. "You didn't want to know," she said. "You made sure you wouldn't have to." He closed his eyes and let out a shaky exhale, as if he was bracing himself for the truth he had avoided. "You're right," he admitted. "I didn't want to look too closely because I was afraid of what I would find. I thought if I kept my distance, I could move on. But I haven't moved on, Skylar. Not for one day. She looked at him then, really looked, and saw that there were lines on his face she hadn't noticed before, tiny betrayals of time and the way it changed a man whether he admitted it or not. Part of her felt a flicker of cruel satisfaction to see he hadn't been immune to consequence. But there was no relief in it. It didn't give her back the nights she had spent alone with a feverish baby or the mornings she woke up wondering how she was going to keep the lights on. She felt her throat tighten, but she refused to look away. "Why now?" she asked. "Why come over here? Why try to talk to me at all?" He hesitated as if searching for an answer that wouldn't sound hollow. "Because I saw her," he finally said, his voice low. "And in that moment I knew I'd made the worst mistake of my life." His gaze dropped to Olivia, who was still pressed against her, watching him with wide, uncertain eyes. "She looks like you," he whispered. "But when she looked up at me, it was like seeing myself all over again. And I don't even know her name." The confession did something to her composure, a small crack she couldn't quite seal. She swallowed and smoothed Olivia's hair, needing something solid to touch. "You don't get to expect anything from us," she said. "You walked away. You left me to figure this out on my own. I don't care what you regret." His eyes lifted, and for the first time she saw them filled with something unguarded and painfully human. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said. "I don't expect you to let me in. But please, can I at least talk to her?" Skylar felt her pulse hammering in her throat. Everything in her wanted to say no, to protect the small, safe world she had built around her daughter. But she looked at Olivia and thought about how many times she had asked where her daddy was, why she didn't have one like the other children at daycare. And she knew she would have to face this moment eventually. It was better that it happened on her terms than by accident later. She knelt beside Olivia and met her daughter's confused gaze. "Liv," she said softly, her voice trembling just a little, "this is someone who knew Mama a long time ago." Olivia studied her with solemn curiosity, then looked at Alexander, her small brow furrowing. Skylar's throat tightened even more, but she forced herself to go on. "His name is Alexander," she said. He's your father." The word fell between them like something too heavy to lift. For an instant, no one spoke. Then Olivia looked back up at her, her eyes wide. "Daddy," she said, testing the word as if it were a foreign language. Skylar closed her eyes and let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. When she looked back up, Alexander had sunk to one knee, his face pale and stricken, and there was nothing polished or powerful about him anymore. He just looked like a man who had finally realized the cost of everything he'd thrown away. Alexander didn't know how long he stayed kneeling there on the pavement, but eventually he became aware of how many people were slowing down to look. He didn't care. For years, he had built his reputation on never letting emotion interfere with his decisions, but standing in front of Skylar and the little girl he hadn't known existed, he felt like the man he had been was a stranger to him now. He looked up at Olivia, who was staring at him with the quiet, serious attention children sometimes gave to things they didn't fully understand. Her blue eyes were so much like his own that it made his chest ache. He wanted to reach for her, to say something that would make this easier, but he had no idea how to speak to a child whose first years he had missed completely. Skylar shifted beside her daughter, her hand resting protectively on Olivia's shoulder. There was no anger in her expression anymore, only a kind of tired wariness that made him feel even smaller. He understood that she was allowing this moment not for his sake, but for Olivia's. That knowledge humbled him more than any failure in business ever had. He swallowed, trying to steady his voice, and said the only thing that came to him. "Hi, Olivia," he managed, his tone soft, unsure. I'm sorry I wasn't here before." The little girl tilted her head, studying him the way she would study something unfamiliar but interesting, and he felt his throat tighten with the effort it took not to cry. Skylar spoke next, her voice quiet but firm. "You need to understand that she doesn't know you," she said. "You can't just appear and expect this to make sense to her." He nodded immediately. "I don't expect anything," he said quickly. I couldn't walk away again. I had to at least look her in the eye and tell her that I know I failed. His gaze flicked down to the sidewalk. And that I'm sorry. A silence stretched between them, full of all the things neither of them could bring themselves to say. Olivia shifted her weight from foot to foot, then reached for her mother's hand. Skylar glanced down and gave her a reassuring squeeze before meeting Alexander's eyes again. We were just about to go home, she said. There was no invitation in her tone, but no final dismissal either. He understood that this was as much as she could offer, and it was more than he deserved. He nodded again, feeling unsteady. I can walk you, he said, his voice low. If that's all right. Skylar hesitated, and for a moment he was sure she would refuse. But after a long pause, she gave a small nod. She turned to Olivia and brushed the hair from her forehead. We'll take the bus home, sweetheart, she murmured. Olivia glanced between them with wide, questioning eyes but didn't protest. Skylar lifted the strap of her bag higher on her shoulder and began walking toward the corner. Alexander fell into step a few paces behind them, afraid to get too close. They moved slowly along the sidewalk as the shadows grew longer, and Alexander realized he was memorizing every detail. The way Olivia skipped over the cracks in the pavement, the way Skylar kept glancing back to make sure he hadn't disappeared. He wanted to tell her that he wouldn't vanish again, but he knew words meant nothing without proof. He thought about all the birthdays and bedtime stories he had missed, all the nights Skylar had sat alone, and he wondered how he had ever convinced himself that success was worth more than this. When they reached the bus stop, Skylar turned to face him. Her expression was careful, composed, but he could see the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. You can't expect her to understand what you are to her yet, she said. I won't let you confuse her or make promises you don't keep. He felt the weight of her gaze and nodded. I'm not asking you to trust me, he said. I'm just asking for the chance to be here. To do this the right way, even if it's too late. A horn blared as the bus approached, and Olivia turned, her small face brightening at the familiar sound. Skylar took her hand and guided her toward the open doors. Before she stepped up, she looked back at him one last time. Her voice was very soft when she spoke. I don't know if I can ever forgive you, she said. But she deserves the truth. He swallowed hard, feeling something loosen painfully in his chest. I know, he said simply. And then she turned away, leading Olivia up the steps into the bus. As the doors closed, Olivia pressed her hand to the window, her palm small and tentative against the glass. Alexander lifted his own hand in answer, and for a fleeting moment, her blue eyes met his. When the bus pulled away, he stood there long after it disappeared, feeling like he was finally beginning to understand everything he had lost and everything he still hoped to find. Alexander returned to that same bus stop the next day because he didn't know what else to do. He told himself he had meetings, calls, a life that still needed his attention, but none of it felt real anymore. All he could think about was the way Olivia had looked at him through the glass, her hand pressed to the window like she wasn't sure whether to wave or not. He spent the night in a hotel only a few blocks from where Skylar lived, staring at the ceiling as dawn crept slowly across the unfamiliar walls. Every hour that passed made it clearer to him that he couldn't pretend his life had meaning without trying to make amends, no matter how hopeless it seemed. When the first light of morning touched the tops of the trees, he walked the neighborhood for over an hour before he finally gathered the courage to approach their building. It was small, older than he expected, with paint peeling on the trim and a narrow flight of steps leading to the door. He tried not to imagine Skylar carrying groceries up those stairs while Olivia tugged at her sleeve. He had never thought much about how she lived, too certain that if she needed something she would have asked. Now he realized she had never trusted him enough to believe he would help. He waited on the sidewalk, unsure whether knocking on her door unannounced was the right thing. He wanted to respect her boundaries, but he also couldn't bear the idea that if he walked away now, she would think he had changed his mind again. He was still standing there when the door finally opened. Skylar appeared first, dressed simply in jeans and a soft gray sweater, her hair pulled back from her face. She looked tired, but when her eyes met his, they were clear and steady. Olivia followed a moment later, clutching a small stuffed rabbit to her chest. For a long moment, none of them spoke. The street around them began to fill with the sounds of morning, the rumble of delivery trucks, a dog barking in a yard nearby, the laughter of children further down the block. All of it felt strangely muted, as if you were watching it from the other side of thick glass. Finally Skylar lifted her chin, her voice calm. "You can walk with us to school if you want," she said, and though her words were simple, he felt them settle in his chest like something fragile he didn't dare touch too quickly. He nodded, falling into step beside them as they started down the cracked sidewalk. Olivia didn't say anything at first. She kept her eyes on her shoes, her small hand wrapped tightly around her mother's. He didn't push her to look at him. He only watched her and tried to memorize the way the crown of her hair parted perfectly over the curve of her head, how the edge of her pink coat brushed her knees as she walked. He had missed every tiny detail, and he knew he could never get that time back. Skylar didn't try to fill the silence, and he was grateful. They reached the corner where the school gates stood open, children streaming inside with bright backpacks. Olivia finally glanced up at him, her expression wary but curious. He crouched down so he could look her in the eye without towering over her. "Hi again," he said softly, and to his amazement, she didn't flinch. She studied his face like she was trying to decide what to do with him. Then she shifted her weight and turned her face into her mother's hip, hiding. He felt something sharp twist behind his ribs, but he didn't let it show. He knew this was what he deserved. Skylar touched Olivia's hair, smoothing it back, then looked at him. "She's shy with people she doesn't know well," she said. "You can't expect her to feel comfortable right away." He nodded quickly. "I don't," he said. "I'll wait as long as it takes." He stood again and stepped back, giving them space. Skylar's gaze held his for a moment longer, searching, measuring, and then she nodded once. "We'll be back here at 3, she said. "If you want to come then." He swallowed, unable to speak around the knot in his throat. He only nodded, and she turned to lead Olivia inside. He watched them walk through the gates until they disappeared into the crowd. The rest of the day passed in slow motion. He tried to focus on his work calls in the hotel lobby, but every time he closed his eyes, all he saw was Olivia's small face turning shyly away. At 5 minutes to 3, he was already waiting at the corner. When they reappeared, Olivia was holding a piece of construction paper painted with bright yellow flowers. She was talking softly to Skylar, her free hand gesturing as she described something important. She didn't notice him until they were almost beside him. When she did, she stopped, her eyes going wide, and looked up at her mother. Skylar waited, giving her a chance to decide for herself. Slowly, Olivia stepped closer to him, lifting her artwork for him to see. He knelt again, his heart beating so loudly he could hardly hear. "These are flowers," she said in a small voice. "I painted them for Mama." "They're beautiful," he said, and for once his voice didn't shake. "You're a very good artist." She studied him for another moment, then nodded solemnly as if she had decided something important. Without a word, she reached out and pressed the paper into his hands. It was the smallest gesture, but it felt like the beginning of everything he had thought he'd lost forever. The days that followed blurred together in a rhythm Alexander had never known before. Each morning he woke with the same nervous ache in his chest, unsure if Skylar would allow him to come along or if Olivia would even look at him. He never assumed he was welcome, but he showed up all the same, standing at the end of the walkway until Skylar lifted her hand in a cautious greeting. He learned to walk beside them without reaching for Olivia's hand, letting her decide when she felt safe enough to stand close. He watched her grow a little braver each day, first glancing up at him, then asking shy questions, and finally offering her drawings as if they were tokens of cautious trust. One afternoon as they left the school, Olivia surprised him by slipping her small hand into his without looking up. Her palm was warm and soft, and he held it gently, terrified he might somehow scare her away by holding too tightly. Skylar noticed but didn't comment, only watched them with an expression he couldn't quite read. For the rest of the walk home, Olivia chattered about a book she'd read, pausing now and then to make sure he was listening. He answered every question, even the smallest ones, feeling something uncoil in his chest he hadn't known was there. It was a kind of quiet peace he had never found in boardrooms or penthouses or the long hours spent chasing respect from people he didn't even like. That evening, Skylar invited him inside for tea. It was the first time he'd crossed the threshold of their apartment. He removed his shoes carefully and stood in the narrow entry, taking in the walls hung with Olivia's paintings and the tiny kitchen where Skylar moved like someone who had built a life out of necessity instead of choice. She poured tea and set 2 cups on the small table, then sat across from him without meeting his eyes. For a while neither of them spoke. The only sound was Olivia humming softly to herself in the next room. Finally Skylar drew in a steadying breath. "I don't know what you expect from me," she said, her voice low but even. "I'm not ready to pretend the past didn't happen." "I don't expect you to," he said at once, because he had rehearsed this in his head 100 times. "I don't want you to forgive me if you can't. I only want to be here. To know her. To help." She looked up then, and her eyes were tired but not unkind. "You can't fix what you broke by showing up for a few weeks," she said. "She doesn't understand why you were gone. One day she will." "I know," he whispered. "And when that day comes, I'll tell her the truth. That I was a coward, and that it was my fault. Not yours." Her gaze held his for a long time, searching for any sign that he was lying. Finally she nodded, as if she had decided to believe him a little. "I'm not making any promises," she said quietly. "I'm not asking for any," he replied. After a while Olivia wandered in with her stuffed rabbit, climbing into Skylar's lap. She looked at him, her blue eyes solemn, and he realized she was waiting for something. He opened his arms a little, not sure if she'd understand the invitation. To his astonishment, she slipped off Skylar's lap and crossed the small space to crawl into his. Her head rested against his shoulder, and he held very still, as if any sudden movement would break the spell. Skylar didn't say anything, but her eyes glistened. For the first time since the afternoon in the plaza, she didn't look like she was bracing for disappointment. She looked almost at peace. Later, when it was time to leave, he gently set Olivia back on her feet. She reached for her mother's hand but turned to look at him with a small, tired smile. He felt something in his chest pull tight and then loosen, as if it were finally safe to breathe. At the door, Skylar met his gaze one last time. "You can come tomorrow," she said, her voice soft. He nodded, unable to speak around the ache in his throat. As he stepped into the cool night air, he felt a kind of quiet certainty he hadn't known in years. He knew he still had everything to prove, that trust would take time, that forgiveness might never come. But he also knew that for the first time in his life, he was exactly where he belonged. I think the ending of this story is quietly powerful because it doesn't pretend that love or regret alone can erase years of absence. What makes it satisfying is how honest it is about the consequences of Alexander's choices. He doesn't get an instant reunion or unconditional forgiveness, he gets a chance to show, day by day, that he can be better. I appreciate that Skylar's response is cautious but hopeful. She doesn't let him back into her life because she's still in love with who he was, she lets him in because she sees he's finally taking responsibility. The story also respects Olivia's perspective. She's too young to understand everything, but her slow, tentative acceptance shows that children are often more open-hearted than adults, provided they feel safe. The final scene feels earned rather than sentimental. It's not a promise that everything will be perfect, just the promise that he won't disappear again. That, to me, is the most moving part, the idea that redemption doesn't come from one apology but from the choice to keep showing up, no matter how hard it is.